So let's start with crazy. So we know Roswell was in 1947. What happened in 1947? There was a crash in New Mexico outside of Roswell. Actually, there was two UFOs that ran into each other. Okay. And so there was two crash scenes that people didn't know about for a long time. But we're not going to talk about that long story and all the rigmarole what happened, but we're going to find out what was recovered and how we know that this is a true event. Because some people still think, I don't believe Roswell really happened. Blah, blah, blah. We're way beyond that. Okay. So what happened at Roswell? The rancher came across some debris on his ranch, and he went to the local sheriff and reported it. And they thought it was like a plane crash or something, since there was an Air Force base outside in town. So they went and told the Air Force people, and they went and picked up this wreckage, and they was examining the wreckage, and this is where our story begins with this wreckage. That because on the main guy, one of the main guys from the base that picked up the wreckage and was bringing it back to the base, he showed it to his son, and several other people on the base saw different things. But how I know this is a real event, because not because of what people wrote today. You know, today you can write anything. The best thing to know about Roswell, and the best thing you need to do, is if you want to find out what is true and what is based off of TV, so you can write a book about what's going on TV today very easily. But there have been UFO books written all the way since the late 40s, early 50s is when the first UFO books started coming out. Those are some of the books that you need to be reading. It's some of the very first UFO books, especially the ones in the early 50s. Those books talk about things that they didn't have TV back in those days. And they talk about the strange stuff that we have today, but they didn't have names for it. So this is how we know this is a real event, because a lot of those books describe what some of the strange stuff that they found. And remember, back in the late 40s, they did not have plastics. They didn't have anything. Okay, this was after World War II. Okay, they talk about the I-beams that they found on the wreckage. They was like metal, super strong, but they was super light. Today we would call those, there was very types of plastics, very hard plastics. Okay, and they had this strange writing on them. They talk about that inside the craft did not have any wires. They had glass tubing running throughout the craft. Today we have a name for this glass tubing. It's called fiber optical cable. Okay. They talk about that the suits that these beings was wearing was like a cloth, but you couldn't cut it with a knife. You couldn't tear it. It was indestructible. We call that today Kevlar. They talk about how, and this talked about in other books too, how inside of the UFOs they had solid walls, there was no windows, but you could do a switch or a lever and the wall would like disappear, and you could see outside as if it was just a window open. We call that today high definition TV. They said on the UFOs they had no control surfaces. They just had silver boards. But when you looked at the silver boards under a microscope, it looked like a tiny checkerboard. We call that today integrated circuit boards. When they did autopsies on these strange beings, they talk about how they had lenses over their eyes. And when they removed the lenses, they said that with these lenses, you could see at night as if it was day. Today we call that night vision goggles. All of this stuff is described, and so much more is described in these books in the 1950s, but they didn't have words for any of this stuff. So they're just describing this stuff. And this is what the book The Day After Roswell is about this guy who worked at the base. And years later, he was given the job of taking these artifacts and taking them to different companies in the United States to back engineer these items so they could be used in the Defense Department. And slowly they worked their way into where we have them today. Remember, the military is anywhere from 25, 50, some people say as far as 75 years more advanced than what we are today.
Karen asked, was the craft round?
No.
Okay.
The craft that crashed was not totally round. It was okay. There's different accounts on what the craft looked like. Okay, because remember when they saw the craft, it was broken. So some people say it was like a half moon. But that could be because the craft was broken. So it could have been a round craft. We do not know. Okay. Okay, I'm getting some. Okay. So the original word, we're going to take a diversion and talk about something. The original word flying saucer comes from when UFOs was first seen earlier that year, 1947, when they was flying in the state of Washington near this mountain. And this pilot says that he saw these vehicles that was like they was flying like they was skipping. And the word was coined flying saucer. But he drew a picture, and tomorrow I will post the picture that he drew. And he drew a picture of aircraft that was not round. He drew a picture of some aircraft that was, delta wing craft, which was very similar to craft that the Germans was flying that no one knew about. These Horton Brothers crafts. And the Horton Brothers, this gets into Operation Paperclip, which we're not going to, which we're going to discuss in a further broadcast. But at the end of the war, the Nazis had technology which you couldn't believe. The Nazi had fighter jets that was flying 1,200 miles an hour. Okay, that's why we was bombing them 24 hours a day. We had to get rid of those German super weapons. And that's what he saw with some of these delta wing craft. But what crashed at Roswell was this circular thing that was broken open. Okay. And as I said, what other question? Is there another question?
No, not yet.
Okay, excellent. So, we're getting into, and the purpose of of what we're talking about today is not that what they found or what the bodies look like or whether they 3 feet or 4 foot tall, did they have 4 fingers or 5 fingers. We're not going there, because this is what people want to get tricked up at. Okay, these beings basically, if you read different books or people who saw the bodies describe them differently. Some people said they had 4 fingers, some people had 5 fingers, some people said it was this, some people said it was that, but they all say they looked at like small children. And people that saw the craft all say the same thing. It was not the size for a people of our size. It was for small beings. Okay. And I don't care if this was a German craft or a French. Nobody had small children flying around back in the 40s. Even today, you don't see an aircraft powered flying kids flying around an aircraft. Okay, so we don't need to get into that argument. Maybe this was this, maybe this was that. Because the things that was in that craft was very strange. And all these things that was strange, we have names for today. And this is what the book The Day After Roswell is talking about, is that all this technology we have today is not our technology. Is that we have alien technology. And the alien technology we have today is what's leading us into this future, which is very, very, we're going to discuss that. Because there's problem with this future that we're heading into. Okay. But, so, let's talk about so what this guy did. He was given all this technology. He took it to industry. And they was working on this stuff to try to figure out how this stuff worked. And a lot of this stuff at the time, like fiber optical cable, there's been arguments on fiber optical cable, computer chips, all this stuff where they say, no, aliens didn't invent this, we invented this. But when you do the research on a lot of this stuff, you can't find, when things are invented normally, you can see the progression, just like the progression of the cell phone. If you go from the progression of the cell phone from the early, the one we saw as a cell phone came out in the early 70s. The militaries had crude cell phones back in Vietnam and whatever, where they had the radio strapped on their back. You can see how the cell phone evolved. Where instead of a soldier with a giant phone strapped on his back, they kept making it smaller and smaller to where you had this handheld device, and then the device kept getting smaller and smaller, and it kept getting smarter and smarter and smarter. Okay, we can all notice that, right? So if you look at, if you see any film of Vietnam, you see the radio guy with this radio on his back. And that turned into the cell phone of the 1970s that we had. The military probably had cell phones in the, before that. But you can see the evolution. A lot of things we have today, there is no evolution. It just appeared. Mm-hmm. Okay. It didn't exist, and then it existed. And when it existed, and when it came into existence, it was finished. Like Kevlar. It was, they didn't have it, and then they had it, and when they had it, it was perfected. Because a lot of this stuff is not our technology. And the same with fiber optical cable, the same with a lot of this stuff. So you could say, who cares? But the problem is, we're going to talk about a movie.